All right, everybody, welcome back. This will be podcast number 4 of the Recovery Lab podcast series. My name is Drew Hassan. I'm a local person in recovery in Jackson, and we have started this podcast in an effort to promote all things of or related to recovery. I've got my brief spiel that I've been given before each one. I will pare it down as much as I can. Please invite everybody to comment a lot, to give me some constructive criticism, suggested topics, nominate somebody to be on the podcast. The more y'all are interactive and in exchange, the better the podcast will be. If anybody wants to help me out, I'm still looking for a thing called a mixer to plug in the microphones. If anybody knows where one is or wants to donate one, I will certainly use it. Okay, nobody tunes in to listen to me ramble on. So without further ado, I am super excited to welcome Keenan Wald to the podcast today. He is the director of the Pines in Katy Hill Treatment Center in Columbus. So without further ado, Keenan, welcome.
Thank you very much, Drew. I'm happy to be here.
Good. Well, I don't know that anybody would realize this, and I guess you won't say it for whatever HIPAA reason. So I went to the Pines. It plays a chapter or two in my recovery story, and I often think to myself, I wonder how much misery I could have saved my life had I not left the Pines in the middle of the night doing the stupid things that we often do. But anyway, I liked the Pines. I always liked and enjoyed listening to Keenan speak. And Keenan spoke at the Lawyers and Judges Assistance Program. And I was so taken with what he had to say, I thought, I would be remiss not to have an opportunity to share that with everybody. So I've already given Keenan a little bit of a heads up about the things I want to talk about. But Keenan, how are you doing this morning? How's life in Columbus?
Oh, it's good. It's a rainy day, and so I will probably end up being stuck inside all day, but no, it's things are going really well.
Well, then I feel less bad about consuming your Saturday morning doing this.
Oh yeah, no worries at all. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, look, I'm gonna try to throw you a few softball questions because really I just want to listen to you talk because you really are an engaging speaker. What are some of the How can Keenan this morning help somebody get sober? What's one or two things you would want somebody to know?
Oh man, that's a heavy question. I feel like there are people in my personal life that would want me to be able to answer that definitively, and when you deal with addiction, we frequently want answers or solutions that are foolproof or definitive.
Yeah, we certainly seek those absolutes. Yeah.
Oh man, and one of the things that I've learned from my experience, both my personal experience in recovery, but also in my experience of treating addiction, is that you cannot. It's very difficult to have absolutes in every situation. And so I think right now the message I would have for people is that recovery is about continued attempts, and whatever that means, continued attempts. There was such a goal of abstinence for so long, and somebody can do really well with abstinence for a period of time, and then they struggle, and that struggle can be such a blow. It can be such a lightning strike that maybe they have difficulty getting back engaged into what they were doing in recovery. And so I think the real message is just, recovery is continuing to try or continuing attempts to do whatever might be in front of you, to have make different decisions, to not use, to not drink, that we don't necessarily have to put everything up to success or failure.
That's really interesting that you said that because this dovetails nicely into. There was one thing that I remembered I remembered a number of things, but one thing in particular that you said when I last saw you speak, you were retelling a tale I believe, some fella who had, did what I did, left in the middle of the night from the Pines, relapses pretty immediately, and then comes back. And you said, that should count as a victory. And I remember it challenged my kind of binary thoughts on recovery. You either are sober or you are not, and to be not sober is a loss. And you were championing this guy, and you're like, this is a victory. Somebody relapsed and they came back not dead.
Yeah.
And they didn't OD, and they used the tools that were available to them. I mean, I think that's really something. Now, I know there's somebody out there that's thinking, well, hell, Drew and Keenan said that, if I relapse, it's not that bad. It is that bad. It is bad. And we should certainly shoot for continued sobriety. But yeah, slips happen. And I'm sure you see that more in your life than I do in mine.
Yeah, and I also think that there is you cannot get away from a sense of morality when we talk about addiction. And it's such a complex condition that, there are people, and I agree, there are people who be like, well, you're just kind of giving permission. If you just, when I first got to the Pines in Katy Hill, we had a rule, and this wasn't my rule, it was a rule in general of our program that if, once you left treatment, you couldn't come back for a year. And I remember, and I didn't know that, I just came in and somebody was reaching back out and somebody said, well, we don't let people come back for a year. And I thought, that is just, baloney. If someone's asking for help, we get them in. We try and help them if we can. And, that.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I was just recounting to a loved one this morning about, Malcolm Gladwell has that book, The Tipping Point. And, you never know which relapse is the last one. And you never know what is that kind word, what is that supportive thing, what is that last, trip to the dope boy. You have to give hope to that newly recovered person and treat them as if, this 10th conversation with them about, admitting you're powerless, or this 10th conversation about how, your behavior brought on these consequences might be the one that sticks with them.
Well, and statistically, look, addiction treatment is I guess I want to be careful of what I say, but, if we measure successful recovery based on continued abstinence from the point of treatment, treatment is really not a very successful venture.
Well, if measured by that metric, yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, and most people, in the rooms, in the 12-step rooms, there's almost this, a common phrase is, relapse doesn't have to be a part of your story. And that is true. It doesn't have to be a part of everybody's experience. But, it is very, very frequent. It is something that is very much a reality. And we've kind of gotten to a point where there are times when I'm afraid where it's almost like there's hesitancy to talk about relapse because it'll push people towards relapse. And, I'm a therapist, and so one of the fears of talking about suicide with somebody, one of the unfounded fears, is that somehow talking about suicide is going to put somebody in a situation to thus think about suicide and potentially be at risk. And the opposite is true. If we can get people to talk about suicidal thoughts or suicidality, we can see a decrease in that. And it's the same for relapse. Let's talk about the reality of it, because we can decrease it if we put it out in the open.
Look, I completely agree. One of the motivations for my doing this podcast is the hopes that somebody can listen to it and benefit from my and the guests being real honest about the consequences they had, the shortcomings they have, the struggles they may have, even in continued sobriety, in the hopes that by laying bare those things, they can think, well, hell, I'm kind of the same way. I'm glad Drew struggles,
Yeah.
even though he's been sober for
Yeah.
5 years now. I'm glad Drew has a temper. I mean, we tend to want to put on this fake front like that things don't bother us. When, I don't know how many times somebody's asked for, does anybody have something they want to talk about at the meeting? And I sit there quiet, knowing full well I should talk about my temper tantrum that I had earlier that day, or I should talk about how, I want to kick the cat and the dog and all that.
Well, and that right there is that's more about recovery than not walking into a bar.
Yeah, I get that.
It's the day in, the day out, the trying to, there's this framework of my mind that was, from birth on has created a human, me, that is prone to certain things. And for some reason, a lot of that turns into addiction if I don't even know, I am prone to that. When I mess up or when something happens or I feel whatever I feel, one of the things I have to be aware of is that I could be prone to addictive behaviors, including substance use. And so that's the framework of my mind. I can do a lot of therapy. I can do a lot of reflection. I can meditate. I can pray. I can do all this stuff. But by my default nature, I'm just sort of prone to that. And I say that with no judgment. Like that's my reality. That's how I perceive me. And so when my grounding is rocky, it's important for me to keep recovery people around me, whatever that means, because I'm just prone to that. And I was 23 when I went to a treatment center, and I spent the majority of my adult life in recovery. I dealt with alcoholism and addiction in recovery more than I have in active. And it's funny that it's like I see it more in my life now than I did when I was drinking and using.
Those cluster of behaviors that don't serve us, that kind of thing.
Oh, yeah, and sometimes they do serve us. I can obsess better than I'm really good at obsessing about things. I'm really good at losing interest in things after obsessing about them. I can take this very all or nothing sort of thing, and I'm not an expert on brain chemistry and stuff like that, but I'm fascinated by it. And dopamine is our reward chemical, and reward becomes motivation. And it's no surprise, and addiction is essentially built upon the foundation of spiking dopamine. And so it's no surprise to me that behaviors that are related to dopamine, I still, are still very prevalent in my life.
Yeah, the gambling, the food, I can get that.
Well, and my wife jokes with me because I go after hobbies, and somebody once really early in my recovery, somebody said, alcoholics don't have hobbies, we have obsessions. And, I'm walking around in a spare room in our house that has become like a storage unit of my lost hobbies. I have a coffee roaster over here. I have a 3D printer. I have, a set of golf clubs. It's like the graveyard of these hobbies or obsessions that I was all about and researched and read about obsessively and got the equipment, and then I did it for about a month,
Right. Look, I don't know anybody that couldn't relate to that. What do you think it is about the brain that makes us so susceptible to such things?
Flatly, I don't know, but I've read and I've heard and I've kind of researched some things, and what I know is that drugs act on brains in similar ways, and when we take a drug, it's going to mess with the chemicals that we already have. And there are a broad array of people in the world, and there's some people that just don't get if they get high, they're going to get high too, but they may not get the same level of reward that for some reason I got. And that reward certainly is, hey, I'm having fun. This is a good time. Things are good. But in addiction, it evolves into this sense of comfort and sense of belonging. And for me, that's what it was. And I see that with a lot of people that are dealing with addiction. It ties into this very sense of who we are, more so than people who may get high and may not have that same sense. They just have a good time.
Provide some sort of the synergistic effect of both hitting those dopamine receptors that we won't hit, and also making us feel loved, welcomed, acknowledged, a part of.
Yeah, yep, yeah, and everybody has these key words that work for them, and I can relate to most of it. It's funny that in treatment, we may be treating somebody who is, and there's no, let me say this, going back to my original statement of, I don't think there's any absolutes. There are some people that only do cocaine, some people that only do heroin, but for the most part, we sort of fluctuate through our lives, or, man, I used to be really into drinking, but now I'm just smoking weed every day. That's variance. But there are certain things that people that primarily use opioids or heroin or fentanyl nowadays, that they may be able to jive with one another. And there's certain things about alcohol or people that struggle with alcohol that they may jive together. But on top of that, there is also a lot of things that folks that use those two substances can relate with. And that's where we start talking about the emotional stuff, the sense of belonging, the identification of who I am. And it's strange to me that somebody who primarily does, methamphetamine or a stimulant, and somebody that does a depressant, that they can relate together so well, because the substances are doing dramatically different things to their mind and body.
Look, I totally get that. And I think when we get down to it, and are willing to look at it, we're all, there may be varying motivations that led to our usage. You could have childhood trauma, you could have abuse, you could have some adult trauma, that's kind of pushing you towards inebriation and disconnect from those feelings. But the things that tend to keep us there, once we've gotten to where we're using, the things that keep us to where we continue using, the overlap is the same. I mean, in that Venn diagram, it's all about that escapism, and that drive is something that meth head or a dilaudid junkie can certainly grab hold of. Look,
I think.
Go ahead.
I think, and just to kind of piggyback on what you said, I think in general, addiction starts out as pleasure seeking and it ends with pain avoidance. That is your typical path for with addiction and alcoholism. Pleasure seeking, pain avoidance.
Look, I remember the first time I ever felt opiate withdrawal was dope sick, and I thought I had the flu, and I didn't know what was wrong with me. And then I thought, this is awful. Like, I've gotten myself I wasn't planning to have this kind of problem. I just wanted to escape. And then it becomes doing that which is necessary not to feel the withdrawal symptoms.
Yeah, that's one of the things about opioids. And there's no substance that's more difficult. There's no substance that is harder to recover from. I really do believe that. But there's certain things about each one that make it particularly unique and challenging. And one of the things about opioids is the high tolerance rate coupled with the long-lasting and very uncomfortable withdrawal symptoms.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, we're just melding right into my little outline here. So, speaking of withdrawal symptoms, I'll throw you a softball. Why should we in the recovery community tolerate the widespread use of Suboxone when we see in the recovery community an abuse didn't exactly take off? Is the use of Suboxone or methadone a crutch? Do you support it? Why or why not?
When I was, I lived in upstate New York for 5 years. I'm originally from Montana, and initially got into recovery in Montana, and then wanted to just go where the wind took me, and I ended up in upstate New York. And
you had that wanderlust.
That's right. Yeah. I got in my car, I drove across country, and I listened to Tom Petty the whole way.
The sun was behind you everywhere you drove, wasn't it? Life was good.
Yeah, and arrived. Yep. And I saw this mug at a meeting one time, and it was a quote that is attributed to Bill W. And I can't remember the beginning of it, but it was, such and such got us sober, tolerance keeps us sober. I think it was humility got us sober, tolerance keeps us sober, or something like that. And I remember thinking, what does that mean? What does tolerance mean? And it's, it's funny when those of us with drug problems sit around and we have to make a case to be forgiving of other people around us.
Right.
We're like, most of our life we're people having to find a way to tolerate us and our behavior
right.
that we get around. And so I always laugh when I hear that word tolerate. And I think about that quote attributed to Bill W. But look at, the statistics of Suboxone or buprenorphine they're almost unbelievable. I mean, we're talking, depending on what study you read and if you kind of gather it all in, people stay alive at a rate of between 70 and 90% when they're regular taking buprenorphine or Suboxone. And
look, just because I know my mom or my aunt might be listening, buprenorphine is Suboxone, and it is a daily medication that is taken. And look, if I misspeak, Keenan, please correct me. That has a two-pronged effect. It prevents the person from going into withdrawals, and then it also, if a person were on Suboxone and they used an opiate, they would not feel the euphoric effect of the drug.
Yeah, and there's so many different analogies to use, and for some reason a new one just popped into my head, so I don't know how well this is going to work, but when I take an opioid like heroin or fentanyl or Lortab or whatever, imagine one of those outdoor kiddie pools, and that substance fills up that kiddie pool or a receptor in our brain. And when that happens, we get a sensation that is associated with those substances, mostly connected to dopamine and a brain chemical called GABA and endorphin, which is kind of handles pain relief stuff. So buprenorphine is what they call a partial agonist, which means, your swimming pool is there and you take buprenorphine and, it fills the pool up. But when I get in, the water is not as pleasurable. So the sensation is lessened a little bit with buprenorphine.
Gotcha.
But if I tried to pour a bunch of heroin in that pool, it's already filled with buprenorphine. So the heroin can't get in there. So buprenorphine actually blocks our receptors. It's a really powerful binder to these receptors that prevents other opioids from getting in there. The other two-prong that you're talking about is when they put naloxone with buprenorphine, and that's what they call Suboxone. And the only thing that does is it prevents us from breaking down Suboxone and injecting it. And so buprenorphine is actually the medication that is doing the recovery-based work or the process chemically in the brain to support recovery. Naloxone is just there so that it's harder to break down and inject.
Gotcha. So is the goal of having the man or woman on Suboxone to give them enough abstinence that they may then engage in sufficient behaviors to see a net benefit from being sober?
I think that is one benefit of it. The number one overarching benefit of it is when people are regularly taking it, they die at a much lower rate, and their other opioid use decreases at a very significant rate. You know, it's strange to say this, but if you and I stood on the streets of Jackson and handed out Suboxone, the overdose rate would decrease in Jackson if we just handed it out, because of the chemical structure of what it does. If I'm taking Suboxone, it's going to block a significant amount of other opioids that I may be taking, and I'm getting not sick from. Let me rephrase that. Buprenorphine, once I'm taking it, prevents me. It's like I don't have to go through withdrawal. And so my seeking behavior to use other opioids potentially is decreased as well. Now, I do think in terms of people actively seeking treatment or therapy or help, it's an absolutely necessary component to that too, or it can be a necessary component to that. But the medication seems to have certain benefits whether or not that person is in treatment. They've done studies, and treatment. I love treatment, but they've done studies, and when you add other services on top of buprenorphine use or Suboxone, you don't necessarily see an increase in the prevention of overdose and stuff like that. Now, you may see life satisfaction increase, but if my whole goal is to keep people alive, the medication does that pretty much no matter what else I'm doing.
It's interesting to me. I don't know exactly how noteworthy this is, but the motivations for what lead us to become drug addicts can oftentimes be varied and can be of completely different sources. And then when they're bundled together, they have the net result of driving us towards that escapism that is drug use. And equally as varied are the things that we can do in our lives to help promote recovery. Just like you were saying, there's no absolute, but there are those collections of behaviors that help us and increase the likelihood that we can get sober and stay sober. For example, having a meaningful recovery life, going to meetings, having a sponsor read your big book, medication, taking Suboxone, being regular and faithful about our administration of it. And perhaps the use of Suboxone can give that person an opportunity to add a couple more of those layers of behaviors that will allow them eventually to come off of Suboxone.
Yeah, and
or is it intended to be a lifetime thing?
I think if I had the ability to solely take away my judgment of what I think it means for someone to be on Suboxone, if somebody is doing well and they've been on buprenorphine Suboxone for a year, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they're doing well, and they're functioning, and they are in recovery, whatever that means to them, and why would I want to take them off that medication for any other reason other than, hey, I just don't think you should be taking it?
Well, that's a good point. That's a good point.
And now, if a person, they themselves want to stop taking it, okay. Some people will come in, get on it, really engage in treatment, and be like, look, by the time I leave, I'm on hospice. And it's like, man, it hasn't even been 2 months. Give yourself time, build up a routine. I like to tell people, you really should wait a year before you even talk. I mean, talk about it for sure, but wait a year before you decide that you're going to get off this. Because all the arguments to get off of it that I hear in my recovery world are morality judgments. and it's like, shoot, if this person's alive, that's a win. People are just, they're just dying at a rate, particularly with fentanyl, that I haven't seen. And one of the things I know, and you know this too, because, what we do in society with drugs is people that are older always look back and be like, man, it wasn't like that when I was young, or this wasn't like this or this. But, when I when I was 23, it was in the 2000s, people would certainly die from addiction. But in my world, it was people who had been using chronically for a long time. Nowadays, with fentanyl, we have people dying at just a rate that is so heartbreaking that they never even get a chance to, they just never get a chance.
Yeah, and certainly it is alarming. You can do a little bit and be fine, and do a little bit and be dead.
Yeah, and you don't, you and I could buy the same from the same person at the same time. We each get a little bindle or whatever. We use, and I overdose and you don't, because fentanyl is so small that, I may get 3 grains of it in my half a gram of heroin, and you may only get 1 or 2 in yours. So it's anything to keep people alive is sort of my thing now. But I also believe heavily in treatment. And so if you are, in treatment with us and you're a candidate, we're going to utilize buprenorphine. We're going to push for it. And, the people that don't want it, we can't make people do it, of course. But because the outcomes of it are so good in terms of lowered overdose rate.
What are some other things that you have seen people do that have been successful? Like I guess I'm kind of speaking to maybe the newer person in recovery now, but I'm just trying to help them think of ideas or reinforce the things they may already know that are those indicators of success. What do the successful people do when they come to or leave the Pines or Katy Hill?
Yeah, man. What's hard about that is I've seen people, that build a recovery life around them. They dive into whatever program they dive into. They talk about it. They continue to attend treatment. They continue to attend therapy. They do the deal, and they relapse. And I've seen people that don't do any of that, and next thing you know, it's 4 years later, and they're still in recovery. They're still doing well, whatever. And so I have found that people that are they try not to keep things hidden from the people around them that care about them. That, I think, is a predominant factor in recovery, is that I have people that I talk to that quite literally know everything that's going on in my life. Because we're talking about a condition, we're talking about a disease, we're talking about an illness. There's an author that I really like, and she writes about addiction as a learning disorder, which I just find fascinating. We're talking about this thing that encapsulates our cognition, our emotions, our identity, our memory, pretty much how we see the world and how we see ourselves in it. And as a result, there's going to be blind spots for me because I am trying to change my life. And so if I can just have people around me, healthy people that care about me, that I trust, or I'm maybe trying to learn to trust, that really know what's going on. So many times we talk to someone and they struggled and they come back and it's like, man, you were involved in everything. And they say, yeah, but I was doing X, Y, Z, And it's like, if we only would have known, potentially we could have helped avoid this.
Yeah, and we need those people in our lives that can point that out. I remember one time I went to a meeting and I saw somebody that I hadn't seen in a long time. And, we had this, unhealthy. We were doing unhealthy things, and I just had this bad taste in my mouth. And I called a friend of mine. I was like, I saw this person, and I had a bad taste in my mouth. And he said, well, think about who those people are out there that when you go to a meeting, they think, God, there he is again. That you leave a bad taste in their mouth. And I thought, this is exactly why we talk to people in recovery. It's so that they can point out things that we just don't see. Not that we can't see, but either we're blinded by our own emotional reactions, or we're just not having an objective view of the situation. And yeah, I think there's a lot of magic to what you're talking about being willing to be honest.
Mm-hmm. But I also think that changing our routine, trying to change who we socialize with, and I do think meetings can be powerful. Aside from anything else, I think they can be powerful because I'm going to this place where I'm pretty certain I'm not going to get drunk or high for an hour, and I'm going to listen to people talk about how they have not or are not getting high or getting drunk. And since we've been through so many similar things, I might be able to relate to them. And so, at the very least, what meetings can provide for us is a really strong building blocks for a social network or a social connection that is, you talk about dopamine and reward and belonging, that it has the potential to really fill that space that drugs and alcohol would potentially fit in.
Well, speaking of dopamine and those happy feelings, so I might be the most excited to hear you talk about this because I really took to it when I heard you speak the last time. Walk us through that spiel you had about the parasympathetic nervous system and how good babies are at relaxing and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so there's this researcher, his name is Koob. I can't remember his first name, actually Richard Koob, I can't remember, but
how do you spell Koob?
Koob. And he researches what he calls hedonic states or anti-hedonic states. Essentially pleasure states, reward states, and anti or no reward states. And, people that struggle with addiction we are perfect test studies for people that are studying reward. And, one of the things he says is when we use, for people like me or other people that have substance use problems, when we use, we get a real dramatic spike in dopamine. And that dopamine spike he calls incentive salience. And it's essentially, we are getting more
What was that
reward.
second word? Incentive?
Salience.
Salience?
Yep.
Okay.
Salience. SALIENCE. And we're essentially getting more reward than we expected. We're getting more than we expected. And that spike hits, we get a rush of dopamine, and then our dopamine levels drop because our brain wants to balance out. And so the first step that he talks about in these pleasure states is this spike in reward, this incentive salience. And then we come down. And when we come down, we have low dopamine and whatever else is low in our brain because of this spike that we've experienced. And at this point, our brain enters a sympathetic nervous system response, which is essentially fight or flight. And so, it enters a state that is similar to fight or flight, and we become obsessed and seeking, and we are driven to thus seek out, substances again to get another spike. And so it becomes this sort of cycle of we use, get a rapid spike, we drop, our brain kind of enters a state similar to fight or flight, and then we are seeking to use with the power of the very gear in our brain that reinforces survival. And so, and those of us who have experienced drug use the way that we have, we can relate to, that drive to get high, that drive to use, that drive to get to whatever relief we're getting is so powerful that, most people with drug problems have used literally when they didn't want to, or when they were actively trying not to. And that's that drive for survival that is so innate. And this Koob research, I'm fascinated by it because it spells it out and it makes sense to me. That when we talk about cravings and what is that famous? There's so many famous lines in the big book that talk about the sense of ease and comfort, the obsession and the craving of the abnormal, drinker. That is driven by this fight or flight condition, this sympathetic nervous system. But we have an alternating nervous system as well called the parasympathetic nervous system. And this is where, like a happy baby is laying on their back playing with their two toes and cooing. They're relaxing, they're resting. Think about stress relief when we think about the parasympathetic nervous system. If fight or flight is stress, parasympathetic or rest and relaxation is the relief from that. And over in that parasympathetic side is where we heal, it's where we grow, and what happens with addiction is our drug use tends to promote feelings that the parasympathetic nervous system naturally we want to produce. And so what happens is when we're sober, we're stressed and we're in fight or flight, and when we're high, we get a sense of the feelings we get from the parasympathetic nervous system. And so, if somebody decides to stop using or they get help stopping using, what happens is their stress level shoots through the roof and they have no skills or very, very few skills. Let me rephrase that. Very few known or practiced skills on how to promote rest and relaxation without their substances. They cannot find relief without their substances.
Do you think that? So I pondered a lot about this, and when I heard you give this part of the lecture, I was really trying to focus in my mind on what I could do, like any good drug addict. What can I do to get more of that?
Yeah.
What can I do? What practices can I put in place to help grow this relax like a baby, where their belly fills up and it drops down and they're just, life is good, and they look like they're on Xanax, just as kick back and not a care in the world. What are the things that, as a practitioner in the treatment world, what do you tell people helps with that?
So eventually people are going to have to find and refine and develop their own methods to do this. But in general, trying to eat healthy, stay hydrated, talk about emotions, try and slow down. I tell people when you were young and you did sports, say high school or whatever, a lot of people did sports at that time, at least in this country. And I tell people, do your old stretching routine every morning when you wake up and every night before you go to bed. There's a lot of, we could work out, we could run, we could bike, but it doesn't have to be that stuff. It can develop into that if that's sort of the direction people take it. But at its core, to build a healthy rest and relaxation and stress response, because stress response is good, it's healthy, we need it. To build a healthy balance between those two things, we've got to find a way to rest and relax and heal and grow and stuff like that. And so it's really simple stuff like, sitting down and just trying to breathe deep for 5 minutes, try and clear your mind. I hesitate to use the word meditation because there's so many other things, so many other connotations when we talk about meditation, but breathing exercises.
No, that was exactly the
really
first thing I thought
stuff.
of was I need to do more, that mindfulness meditation. I think they make an app for that. And
and I bought that app at one point, and I probably did it about 3 times.
Right.
I talk about this stuff, and putting these things in practice, for some reason, is something that's challenging for me. Now, I do have a life where I do find those things at times, and I have a pretty, a pretty high impact life. But I have a 5-year-old girl that does a lot of activities, and her mom certainly does most of the work with that. But we're about to start soccer, and I'm going to be a coach and help with her soccer. And, those are the things that help me feel grounded, and I find relaxation in as well.
Yeah, doing those, yeah, there is certainly some magic to doing that which we think we should, as either a father or a person, and then,
Yep.
wrenching from that self-esteem.
Yeah, self-worth, which is absolutely something that is such a common theme with people with addiction.
Well, really, in my mind, so I've told this story recently. When I first got sober, and I was living in Oxford House, and I remember how good I felt about myself when I got a checking account. And I remember how good I felt about myself when I got a driver's license. And, that was real life, tangible proof that I was doing right. And it is, simple as it sounds. That driver's license and checking account I have drawn on even today. Look at what happens if you just stay sober. Look at what happens if you just put one foot in front of the other. Look at what happens if you just stick to it. And
we certainly have to get into the practice of not believing our own thoughts. Selectively maybe, but not believing the entirety of all of our thoughts. Because we'll just doom ourselves into inaction.
Oh, look, I say this all the time. I say it all the time about how we have to learn in recovery how to objectively assess our victories. Because it's real easy to get caught up in what AA preaches. Not that I'm knocking it, about this powerlessness, and you would almost think that they're trying to tell you don't have any control over anything, and I believe that to be baloney, because there's a great deal of things over which I exercise an immense amount of control and power. I can get up and go to work. I can get up and do the things I'm supposed to do. I can pay my energy bill on time. I can, do healthy things. And it is only over the use and that obsession that I think the focus of the powerlessness should be. And, by and large, I think that I've noticed in my own life how I will have a particular difficulty arise, and I somehow internalize that if I'm fearful at all, if I'm scared a little bit, if I'm worried about this particular difficulty, that somehow means that I'm not able to overcome it. Or that when I overcome things, it's okay to have felt fearful and anxious and upset and all those things and still get over that obstacle. And that's a victory. I don't have to have a resounding victory to have a victory.
Yep, that's well said. Yeah.
Well, hey, Keenan, look, man, I try to keep these around 45 to 50 minutes, and we've now hit the 50-minute mark. I don't want to run you off because I think you're the most interesting person, and if you want to talk about something else, I'll certainly modify my time limit rule, but if not...
Well, one of the questions that I don't think I might have answered, and maybe not as directly as I wanted, was with buprenorphine, Suboxone, and particularly the 12-step recovery community.
Oh, let's hear it.
There's a tremendous amount of, and I don't want to speak. My experience is there's a tremendous amount of blowback to people being on Suboxone and attending and engaging in AA or NA or CA or in 12-step programs. This is not a rule, but I tend to see it more often than I like, or I tend to hear about it more often than I like. And, there are people out there that have a good grasp of this, that are in recovery. There are people that are actively taking it and are in solid recovery. And, what I try and tell people is, in general, it is not the general population's business of what medication I'm taking. I don't go somewhere and say, hey, I regularly take, I take Wellbutrin daily, or I take this daily, or Suboxone. In the recovery world, we try and tell people, find someone that you can trust. If you're going to get a sponsor, find a sponsor that you can talk to about this stuff, because they're out there. And I think, thinking that they're all against it is just as much of an error as that's a big error as well. There are people connected with the 12-step community that work with folks that are on Suboxone, as they should. And so,
well, as more and more people like you that can explain the necessity and the reasoning behind the use of Suboxone, the more and more and the more loudly that story is told, I think that we can kind of right this somewhat perplexing idea that it's a moral failure to be on Suboxone. Because look, I've done plenty of garbage things in my life to get drugs. The idea that I should cast judgment on somebody for taking Suboxone is pretty laughable. And I think the same can be said for the most of the people that are judging those fellas or girls.
Well, and in the 12-step world, I don't profess to be an expert on everything written about 12 steps by any means. But if you look at kind of the, some of the things that I think about when I think about Suboxone and recovery and AA is, the whole idea of, I think it's in one of the forewords or in the early part of the book, where they're talking about, of all the people that have engaged in this program, this many people have stayed sober, this many people have relapsed and come back, and this many people show that their lives get better, even if they're unable to maybe put together the abstinence time that they want, is how I interpret it. And I think about that. Our whole goal, what I interpret the 12-step world to be, the whole goal is to help people recover. And when people die, they can't recover.
Amen. I heard that.
And so, that's one thing I really, there are people out there that will benefit from many parts of the 12-step program who happen to be on Suboxone, and those two things are not mutually exclusive. And I just really want people to hear that. The other thing is, you introduced me as the director of the Pines of Katy Hill, and I am less associated with the Pines and Katy Hill as I have been historically. So I am the clinical director for Community Counseling Services, which is a regional mental health center in our region, and the Pines and Katy Hill is a part of that. And so, the alcohol and drug director for Pines and Katy Hill now is Whitney Koss. I'm sure you remember her. And so many of the staff are still there, but my connection with them, I'm still connected with them and still go in and do a group on occasion. But I'm less involved in the day-to-day as I used to be over there.
Well, I'm sorry I made that mistake. I apologize, but I'm glad you corrected me.
No worries.
And look, you and John Conn are the only two people I remember. So.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Keenan, look, man, thank you on behalf of the recovery community. Thank you, me personally. Thank you. You are a value and a blessing to the recovery community.
Well, I appreciate you. I still, at my core, I still love to talk about drugs. It just ends up being about recovery now.
Yeah.
But I appreciate you letting me talk, and it's always great to hear from folks that are doing well. It's really cool to hear and see. So.
Thanks, Keenan. All right, man. I'll see you soon.
All righty. Take care.